The decision to buy the property wasn't rushed or emotional. It was practical, measured, and rooted in the desire for peace. After years of crowded streets, noisy neighbors, and constant compromises, the idea of owning a secluded piece of land felt like a long overdue reward. The listing promised privacy, space, and independence. 5 acres bordering a quiet lake, partially wooded, with a long gravel access road that curved away from the main development. It looked untouched, almost forgotten, and that was exactly what made it appealing. The paperwork revealed something interesting early on. The land was technically adjacent to a planned community, one governed by a homeowners association, but it wasn't part of it. The previous owner had deliberately excluded the parcel decades ago. The HOA map showed a clean boundary line stopping just short of the lake's edge. The access road, docks, and shoreline had complicated annotations, but nothing alarming. Everything appeared legal, recorded, and verified. The sale went through without resistance, and the keys changed hands quietly. Moving in was uneventful at first. Construction began on a modest cabin designed to blend into the landscape rather than dominate it. No fences, no loud machinery at odd hours, no violations of county codes. Permits were displayed properly. Contractors followed schedules. The property remained calm and orderly, just as intended. For the first few days, no one came by. No curious neighbors. No welcoming committee. Just silence, broken occasionally by birds and the distant movement of water. That peace didn't last. The first sign of trouble wasn't dramatic. It came in the form of a notice taped to a temporary post near the entrance of the gravel road. The paper was crisp, professionally printed, and sealed in plastic. It referenced community standards, unauthorized construction, and pending review. There was no signature, just the HOA letterhead and a generic contact number. It was odd. Considering the property wasn't part of the association, but it was easy to dismiss as a mistake. That assumption didn't survive the next day. A black SUV rolled slowly up the gravel road, stopping just short of the construction zone. 2 people stepped out, dressed sharply, clipboards in hand, eyes scanning the land with visible disapproval. They didn't introduce themselves verbally, but their posture made their purpose clear. They were there to inspect, not to welcome. They walked the perimeter, took photographs, and pointed at markers placed by surveyors. Their body language carried authority they assumed would go unchallenged. By the time they left, another notice had been posted, this one thicker, heavier, and more formal. It outlined potential fines, immediate cease and desist expectations, and the requirement for HOA approval before further development. It read as if compliance were not optional. The language was aggressive, confident, and dismissive of any alternative interpretation. The underlying message was clear. Someone believed this property fell under their control. At first, the response was restraint. There was no need to escalate. Mistakes happened, especially with boundary confusion near shared amenities like lakes. The county records were clear, and the deed left no room for interpretation. The HOA had no authority here. A polite email was sent, attaching documentation and survey maps, clarifying the status of the land. It was factual, calm, and deliberately non-confrontational. The reply came faster than expected. It wasn't apologetic. It wasn't curious. It was dismissive. The message stated that regardless of paperwork, the HOA maintained functional control over the lake, shoreline, and access road. It referenced long-standing usage, community investment, and enforcement precedent. It warned that continued construction without compliance would result in penalties, legal action, and potential involvement of local authorities. The tone suggested that resistance would be inconvenient and expensive. That was the moment the situation shifted from misunderstanding to confrontation. A deeper review of the documents followed. Old plats. Easements. Handwritten amendments from decades past. What emerged was a picture far more complex than the HOA likely realized. The access road wasn't theirs. It crossed the property entirely before reaching the community docks. The shoreline where their docks were built rested on land that had never been deeded to the association. It had simply been used without challenge for years, quietly assumed to be communal. The discovery was unsettling, but also revealing. The next visit from the HOA was less restrained. This time, more vehicles arrived. More paperwork. More confidence. Construction workers were told to pause. The tone escalated from administrative to threatening. The implication was that resistance would not be tolerated, and that authority was absolute. But authority only exists where it's legally granted. What the HOA didn't realize yet was that their power depended entirely on assumptions that no one had challenged before. They had grown comfortable enforcing rules beyond their reach. They had mistaken silence for consent. And now, for the first time, someone stood on land they didn't control, with documents they hadn't read, and a willingness to let the truth unfold at its own pace. As the sun set behind the trees and the construction site went quiet, it became clear this was no longer about a cabin or a lake. It was about boundaries, entitlement, and the consequences of overreach. The first chapter of the conflict had ended, but the real confrontation was only beginning. The HOA didn't retreat after the initial resistance. Instead, it doubled down. The pause in construction became their opportunity to assert dominance, and they used it aggressively. Notices arrived almost daily, each one more severe than the last. The language shifted from warnings to ultimatums. Deadlines were imposed. Fines were calculated. Legal terminology was layered in to intimidate rather than clarify. The intent was obvious: overwhelm first, verify later. The association began contacting county offices, framing the situation as an enforcement issue rather than a boundary dispute. Complaints were filed alleging unauthorized development, environmental risk, and disruption of community assets. Each complaint was carefully worded to sound legitimate, even urgent. The strategy relied on momentum, on the assumption that pressure alone would force compliance before facts could slow things down. But facts have a way of resurfacing. While the HOA focused on intimidation, attention shifted toward documentation. Title records were reviewed line by line. Historical plats were compared against modern surveys. Old zoning adjustments were pulled from archives that hadn't been opened in years. What emerged wasn't just a defense, but a revelation. The property wasn't merely independent of the HOA. It was foundational to several of the association's most valued features. The access road, long treated as communal infrastructure, existed entirely on private land. The docks, proudly maintained with HOA funds, extended from shoreline that had never been transferred. The lake itself was public, but the points of access weren't. They had been assumed, inherited through habit rather than law. Over time, no one questioned it. No one challenged it. Until now. The realization changed everything. The HOA's authority depended on control of shared spaces. Without legal access, their rules lost force. Without easements, their leverage disappeared. What had once seemed like unquestionable power now rested on a fragile misunderstanding that had gone uncorrected for decades. The association's leadership, however, was too invested to acknowledge the mistake. Instead, they escalated again. A formal cease and desist letter arrived, signed and stamped, demanding immediate compliance and threatening court action. It accused the property owner of obstructing community access and interfering with association-managed assets. The irony was striking. The very structures they claimed ownership over were built on land they didn't possess. Yet the letter read as if the outcome were already decided. Behind the scenes, tension spread through the neighborhood. Residents began to notice changes. Access to the docks felt uncertain. Rumors circulated about legal disputes and potential closures. Longtime homeowners asked questions the HOA wasn't prepared to answer. Why was there a dispute now? Who actually owned the shoreline? Why had this never come up before? The leadership offered vague reassurances, insisting everything was under control, but confidence was thinning. The pressure campaign intensified on the property itself. Vehicles were parked near the entrance. Contractors were questioned. Photos were taken openly, sometimes repeatedly. The goal was visibility, a reminder that the HOA was watching. But each visit only reinforced the imbalance. They were enforcing rules where none applied. At the same time, preparations were being made quietly. An attorney specializing in land use and property law reviewed the findings and confirmed what the record suggested. The HOA had overstepped not just recently, but historically. Their use of the land had never been formalized. No easements. No agreements. No compensation. What they called community property was, in reality, privately held and legally protected. This wasn't a loophole. It was a foundation. The strategy shifted from defense to patience. There was no need to rush. The HOA was creating its own paper trail. Documenting every threat, every misrepresentation, every assumption of authority. Each letter they sent strengthened the case against them. Each complaint filed with outstanding added weight to what was becoming an unavoidable reckoning. Then came the meeting announcement. The HOA scheduled an emergency board session, inviting residents to discuss ongoing access concerns. The tone suggested unity, but the timing revealed urgency. They were losing control of the narrative. Homeowners wanted answers. The leadership needed to project strength before doubt became dissent. Meanwhile, a single certified letter was prepared in response. It didn't argue. It didn't threaten. It simply presented facts. Deeds. Surveys. Historical records. Legal citations. It outlined ownership clearly and offered a path forward that respected boundaries and law. It made no demands, only clarifications. The implication was subtle but unmistakable, the association's position was untenable. The letter was sent. The reaction was immediate, though not public. HOA communication went silent for days. Notices stopped appearing. Vehicles no longer drove up the gravel road. Contractors returned cautiously, resuming work under valid permits. The sudden absence of enforcement spoke louder than any confrontation. But silence didn't mean surrender. Behind closed doors, the HOA was scrambling. Advisors were consulted. Records were re-examined. Questions were raised that should have been asked years ago. The leadership faced a choice between admitting a long-standing mistake or attempting to force a resolution through authority they didn't legally possess. They chose delay. The emergency meeting ended without clear answers. Residents left uneasy. Trust eroded quietly. The association's confidence, once unshakable, now felt rehearsed and brittle. The illusion of control was cracking, and everyone could sense it. As construction continued and the lake remained still, the balance of power had shifted. The HOA no longer dictated terms. They were reacting, stalling, hoping the issue would fade or resolve itself. It wouldn't. The next phase wouldn't be about paperwork or threats. It would be about consequences, real ones, that couldn't be postponed or ignored. The HOA's final move came quietly, almost cautiously, but it carried the weight of desperation. After weeks of silence, a formal legal filing was submitted, framed as a petition to protect community access and prevent alleged obstruction. On the surface, it appeared calculated and professional. Beneath it, however, was the same assumption that had guided every misstep before, that authority could replace ownership, and persistence could override law. This time, the response wasn't private. The filing triggered a mandatory review by county officials, pulling the dispute out of HOA-controlled channels and into public record. What the association had hoped would pressure compliance instead opened the door to scrutiny. Every claim they made invited verification. Every assertion demanded proof. And proof was something they didn't have. County surveyors revisited the site with updated equipment and original plats. Boundaries were remeasured. Shoreline markers were re-established. Access routes were traced from public roads to the water's edge. The process was slow, methodical, and impartial. There was no room for interpretation, no tolerance for assumptions. The land spoke for itself, the findings were unambiguous. The access road belonged entirely to the private property. The shoreline beneath the docks had never been conveyed to the HOA or its predecessors. The structures themselves existed in a legal gray zone, maintained by the association, used by residents, but resting on land they had no right to occupy. Decades of unquestioned use had created comfort, not ownership. The report forced the HOA into an impossible position. To continue the case would mean arguing against county records, surveys, and their own historical omissions. To withdraw would mean acknowledging that their authority had been overstated for years. Either option carried consequences, but only one offered any chance of control. They withdrew. The filing was quietly dismissed before it reached a hearing. No announcement was made to residents. No explanation followed. But the absence of enforcement spoke volumes. The threat of fines vanished. Notices stopped completely. The association's posture shifted from aggressive to avoidant, as though distance could erase the mistake. It couldn't. Word spread quickly once access to the docks changed. Without legal right-of-way, the HOA had no choice but to restrict use temporarily. Residents who had paid dues for years began asking why amenities they funded were suddenly inaccessible. Board members offered vague answers about ongoing evaluations, but the truth was already circulating. The illusion of authority collapsed. Faced with mounting pressure from within, the HOA attempted negotiation. They proposed retroactive easements, usage agreements, even purchase offers for portions of the land. Each proposal was framed as a compromise, but each acknowledged what they had denied from the beginning, that control had never been theirs. The response was simple and final. There would be no retroactive fixes. No rushed agreements. No reward for years of overreach. Any future access would follow proper legal channels, reflect fair value, and respect boundaries that should have been honored from the start. The land was not a bargaining chip. It was a right. Construction on the cabin was completed without further interference. The property settled into the quiet that had first inspired the purchase. Trees grew undisturbed. The lake remained open, but access was defined, limited, and lawful. What had once been assumed communal was now clearly private. The HOA, meanwhile, changed. Leadership quietly rotated out over the following months. Policies were rewritten. Legal reviews became standard before enforcement. The association's reputation suffered, not from malice, but from exposure. Residents learned a hard lesson about the difference between rules and rights, between governance and ownership. The conflict left no dramatic confrontation, no public apology, no triumphant announcement. Instead, it ended the way many real disputes do, with records corrected, power rebalanced, and silence where noise once dominated. In the end, the HOA hadn't been defeated by aggression or defiance. It had been undone by its own assumptions. They tried to control what they never owned. And once the truth surfaced, control was no longer an option. The story ends not with revenge, but with resolution, and a reminder that authority only exists where the law allows it.